I don't know if a lot of people know this, but HighGuard was actually never supposed to be an FPS hero shooter. A lot of the early art and previs that was done for the game actually suggested, and according to the artist as well, that HighGuard was supposed to be sort of a combination of Rust and Apex, more of a survival FPS. It was supposed to be an open world with quests and challenges that you can pick up and complete, scattered throughout an open map. So I wanted to look at some of the early art that was done for HighGuard, specifically the work of Danny Gardner. This guy's been working with Respawn since very early on, since Titanfall 2. And his work has always been phenomenal. He's done everything from characters, weapons, environment. He worked on Borderlands 3 as well on some of the vehicles. He worked on Apex Legends. And at the very beginning of Wildlight Studios, he worked with Wildlight to do a lot of the previs and concept art for what became HighGuard. And I'll start with this piece titled HighGuard Previs Concept 1, where Danny says, "I present to you my very first piece of art done at Wildlight. Years before HighGuard, the vision was so grand, too grand for our small team and limited time frame. Before pivoting a few times, but when we wanted to create a massive survival FPS, something like Rust plus Apex plus Game of Thrones. Early ideations were insanely fun, and the designers came up with gameplay mechanics that were devastating to shelf. That's the reality of game development though, gotta ship something shippable. This piece represented a ton of ideas we were anxious to explore, mostly what a fantasy game looked like for us. What would a huge open world with crazy scale look like? What about player-built bases, different mobility options, etc., etc. So as I said, HighGuard in the very beginning was supposed to be an open world type of game, and this painting was part of their first exploration into what this world might look like. Right off the bat, my eyes are drawn to these three characters in the foreground, all sporting this kind of circular green technology on their bodies. Kind of reminds me of like the Division watches, symbolizing that maybe these three are part of the same faction or party, setting out into this fantastic world ahead of them. Here we can see what was probably the earliest imagining of the mounts that ended up in HighGuard. The character on the furthest left is riding this horned deer creature, clad in all, sci-fi fantasy-esque armor. And I love that in this, high fantasy world that they wanted to build, our hero is wearing orange Crocs, very appropriately put into sport mode. I think it's also interesting that the character on the furthest right is kind of levitating on this board. Kind of reminds me of like Zenyatta sitting cross-legged, floating across the battlefield. As well as these floating Uzis that have floating magazines as well. I wonder if they were looking into different ways that they could build the combat systems or what that might entail. Overall, this is a pretty standard concept art, early previs composition. The visual design language of the building is sort of still nondescript. It's very Apex in the way that it's constructed. And, same with the monuments in the background. It's sort of just saying there's going to be something epic back there. We don't really know what it is yet, but here's sort of like a pitch of what it might look like. But alas, I think it's a great painting, and it sort of shows us that HighGuard was supposed to sort of be this epic world that you were supposed to explore and not sort of this arena shooter that it turned out to be. For Danny's second piece, we see another really epic environment here, and these characters, that are starting to become more fleshed out. I think the costuming and the props on these characters are sort of reminiscent of maybe Horizon, this sort of scavengery but very cultural take to sci-fi. I think we're starting to see some ideation on what the PvP interactions might look like. This squad of opposing players sort of walking up to a lone character who seems to be camping, and it looks like they're going to be either fighting or having some sort of confrontation take place in this environment. I think it's really interesting the totem that's behind this character. I wonder if that implies that it's a camp of some kind or a base, as well as this armored deer who might be sort of a companion or a pet maybe. Yeah, I don't know, but still very interesting ideas being pitched here. I'm looking at the background here, and at that scale and distance, these birds must be, massive. So I wonder if those were, going to be environment bosses or just background props of these giant animals in the sky. There's also another version of this painting with a different climate, a different season almost. So I wonder if they were thinking about having different weather schemes or, different biomes. And moving on through the rest of Danny's environmental Previs work for HighGuard, we can see a lot of other point of interest concepts and different environments and biomes that all look really, really interesting, and we're supposed to be, different parts of the map for the player to discover and journey through. I think it's really interesting here. He mentions that Wildlight had Vesper, which was their magic stone energy, sort of that was spread throughout the world. It's interesting because I feel like every video game startup, or at least a lot of the startups that I've seen, they always want their own force, their own magical energy, that powers all the magic and the environments of the world. And here for HighGuard, it's Vesper. We also have some early concept for what looks like an in-menu 3D map. This again shows us that HighGuard was supposed to be, this grand open world where you could pick up quests, complete challenges, journey through this vast environment that has different regions. HighGuard was also supposed to have player-built bases, and here we can see, Danny's early explorations on what those might look like. We can see different levels and different layers to this base building. A base that a lower level player might have, as opposed to a base that a higher level player might have. I think it's a shame we never got to see any of these fully developed. I think it'd be really cool, to set out on a journey and then to regroup at one of these structures. Now I want to take a look at some of the mounts that Danny designed for HighGuard. It was probably decided pretty early on that these rideable mounts were going to be a major part of the game. Here we can see a lot of the early ideation that Danny did for these creatures. And they're really interesting, and I wish they made it into the final game, because if I remember correctly, in the final game, the mounts that you ride on are just animals, right? They're just like a bear or like a horse or a tiger or something like that. And we totally lose out on all of this world building that was done in these creatures. As part of the early ideation of the HighGuard world, Danny also drew up these really funky looking golem creatures, which I'm assuming were either going to be PvE enemies or maybe background NPCs. But these look phenomenal. And again, it's such a shame that they didn't have a chance to make it into the final project. And I think a lot of these early drawings of these golems are probably what inspired a lot of the shape and pattern design that we see later in the final characters that went into the game. The last category I want to touch on before we talk about characters, which I know everyone's really excited for, is props. Danny really outdid himself with these. I mean, his exploration into how to combine these fantastical shapes with grounded mechanical forms and how to make it all look, magical but believable. It's really just astounding the amount of exploration and ideation went into every single one of these props. I think what really shows the level of thinking that went into all the weapon designs of HighGuard is seeing all of these optics that Danny designed for the guns. I've been watching a lot of Jonathan Ferguson recently, and he's always talking about how he hates when there's the coolest looking rifle in a game and the most basic optic on it. And I think seeing all of the designs that Danny did for the different sights and scopes, it's really impressive. It's a shame that I don't think that these fully carry over into the game, because I believe Danny mentioned somewhere that at some point in the development process they decided to pull back on how crazy the weapon designs were going to be. And it's a shame, looking at a lot of the earlier weapon designs. These were really wild and innovative, had a lot of unique shapes and designs that I think would have set it apart from a lot of the other designs that we see in the industry. At some point, I think they decided to rein it in and make the weapons more normal, and I think that ended up not making as much of an impact as they wanted it to. As we all saw in the final game, a lot of the weapons that we got to use were sort of basic and, didn't quite make the impression that I think a lot of the earlier designs of the weapons would have. And finally, moving on to characters, before we look at Danny's work in the early development stages of HighGuard, I do want to talk about, the final characters that ended up making it to the game. And all of these characters were done by Cristina Lavina Ferez, who used to be an artist on Apex Legends before working with Wildlight, and ultimately designing all of the characters for HighGuard. I think there's nothing overtly wrong with the way that these characters look. I think what people really weren't responding to, though, is at this point, with this big of a drastic change in game direction, we've sort of lost sight of our world building. And I think it's very evident that these characters are sticking to industry archetypes, let's say, of a hero shooter. And while, there are a lot of cultural references and, things sprinkled in to make the characters more individualistic and unique, ultimately, I do think there's not, a totally unique take on the world that's being built. And I'm not seeing, a lot of references to all of the amazing world building that went into the early stages of HighGuard. Now, as an example, let's take a look at Atticus, who's sort of become the poster child character for HighGuard, the tracer of HighGuard. Now, looking at his design, I think it's a bit of a shame that nothing jumps out to me right away about either his role or his backstory. I think his design embodies a lot of, very sort of stereotypical heroic armor shapes, as well as being, very symmetrical. I think there might just be more opportunities to make references to either his strengths, his role, or his backstory or his culture, right? Early character design for HighGuard had a drastically different approach when it came to, building the world and building the costuming. And here we have Danny's earliest character for the world of HighGuard. We see this archer, hunter type of character wearing a respirator mask, a lot of costuming elements that would suggest that he's in a very harsh environment. We can see this gritty world through, some of the patchwork on his clothing and a lot of the costuming props that are sort of decorating his vest. I really like his wide collar that's embroidered on the interior, and I think the shape language of a lot of this fabric is interesting and very geometric and very futuristic, but again, grounded and believable. He has a tattooed German Shepherd companion wearing a backpack, and they both carry this glowing orange symbol on their bodies, which I think is very interesting. And I also think that the patterning on the German Shepherd itself is very cool, and maybe there might have been ideas that might have been customizable or a cosmetic option or something like that. In the post, Danny writes that he's not a character artist, clearly flexing on all of us. But I think it's extremely impressive that during the early days at Wildlight, Danny was the only concept artist on the team, which is why we see that he was instrumental in, characters, environments, and props, and sort of every aspect of everything that's being developed on the team. We also have this female explorer kind of a character with a climbing hook, a bunch of rope, as well as this headwear, which is emitting some sort of orange aura. I wonder what that's, supposed to do. Now, I do think comparing, the characters of these two different artists it's a bit like comparing apples and oranges, right? Ultimately, Danny's characters wouldn't work as well for a hero shooter. However, I do think it goes to show a lot of the missed opportunities that came because of, that last minute shift towards a hero shooter, right? I think a lot of us would have wanted to see either a single player or an open world group Rust-like game like they originally intended, with these gritty, grounded characters and with this fantasy world that they wanted to build. And to go back to the final characters that came out with the game, although I'm sure Christina did the best that she could, because of this late change, right? This late shift from open world FPS to hero arena shooter, There ultimately ended up not being enough world building and story development done for the final roster of characters that made it to the game. Each character is sort of an archetypal reference to something that I'm sure we've all seen before in the industry. And because of that, they fall sort of flat compared to all of the world building that was done for HighGuard before this point. You know, unfortunately, reading Christina's posts, it seemed like there was a lot of intended story behind all of the characters, you know, that were being designed. All of these characters came from their own countries, had their own cultures and their own backstories. But I don't think they had the opportunity to fully flesh out what these would look like. I think, you know, if they had the opportunity to explore that, maybe those character designs would resonate more with the audience. Ultimately, HighGuard is a cautionary tale for developers to manage your expectations when, you know, starting a new team and developing a new IP. It's such a common theme nowadays that we see a grand vision for a new game that's being made, but you know, game development is hard, and I think we see so many of these teams fall flat, and we see so much amazing art end up not being used for a final product, or, you know, the final product being completely altered from the original fantastic ideas that were being pitched at the inception of these teams. But through all of the struggle of the HighGuard development, at least we got to see so many fantastic pieces of art by Danny Gardner, as well as all the other talented artists on the team. All the art that has gone into this production has been incredible, and even if the final product wasn't what the artist intended, I'm sure, you know, every single one of them are going to go on to create much more incredible things for us in the future. Please go check out Danny Gardner's ArtStation. All of the images that I used for this video were pulled from his ArtStation site. Go and follow him on Instagram as well. I'll have all of his, you know, socials linked below. So let me know what you guys think about the early vision of HighGuard, about what the game was meant to be. Would this have been a game that you'd be excited to play, a world you'd be excited to explore? Would you have rather seen this as, you know, a single player adventure instead of the hero shooter that it turned out to be? Let me know if there's any other game that you guys would like for me to do a deep dive on. You know, I think looking at maybe the Art of Concord would be another really interesting video, and you know, I'm planning on looking at some of the characters, you know, the new characters from Overwatch as well. So, you know, plenty of things down the line to come. So let me know your thoughts, and thank you for watching to the end.